Once again, so good morning, everyone. So Helen Pillar and myself are very happy to welcome Dr. Liz Drenkard from the NOAA Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Laboratory. Liz expertise is in studying the response of ocean dynamics, biogeochemistry, and living marine resources to climate variability and also to climate change. And one of her particular interests is to actually look at implications for conservation and marine resource management. And the tool that she uses is regional modeling, and it's of increasing importance to understand on the small, detailed scale the results and implications for climate models are telling us for projections. Liz holds a PhD from the MIT Woods Hole Joint Program, has a bachelor's from Cornell in biological and chemical sciences, and then the two postdocs at Rutgers, and then most recently, before moving to GFDL, here at Scripps, a beautiful landscape. And so we really, I should also mention, so Liz really did a heroic job in driving after her flight to Austin, or the connection was canceled last night coming. So she drove actually at midnight from Dallas to Austin, arrived here at around 3 p.m. AM. And so we're really, really happy that you went through the ordeal and can be here and present your work to us. So please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. On that note, if I do kind of space out a little bit, I'm going to do my best to be very coherent, but there might be a few times when I look at my slides like, oh, that's interesting. So anyway, I like to start these talks with this beautiful picture. Mostly, I guess, because I really missed Southern California. It's very beautiful, but it's a really great example of why I'm kind of motivated to use regional ocean modeling to study ecosystem implications under changing climate conditions. So this is the Scripps Pier here, and it's a really convenient little scale bar. It's about 1/4 kilometer. I used to give tours on it, so I'm very familiar with how long it is. But you've got this entire gorgeous ocean view that Douglas Alden at SAO got a picture of. But right here, if you can see it, there's this little squiggly black line that kind of goes across the whole thing. And that is schooling, I think it's anchovy, possibly sardine. And it's just so cool to think the ocean is huge, but the animals are really hanging out in this very like structured near coast system. And it's kind of like, okay, well, just having a model or just understanding what's happening in the big ocean isn't necessarily going to tell us what we need to know for keeping those organisms, those fisheries, those ecosystems, going in future conditions. So going forward, this is sort of an introduction to how I got into this. My background is actually, I consider myself a biologist who has now completely switched into ocean and climate modeling. So that's been an interesting experience. In grad school, I actually started out running experiments with baby corals. These are Favia fragum. We would take the adults into the lab, they'd release the babies, we would settle them so they'd metamorphose, go from little swimmy larvae and turn into these settled corals. And we would then subject them to unpleasant conditions, essentially bubbling in CO2 to mimic the effects of ocean acidification. And then we'd see, okay, well, what happens if you feed them? Because they eat little zooplankton. And it was interesting. They got bigger, but they still exhibited sensitivity to ocean acidification. So that was information at the organismal level. And then I got into looking at ocean reanalysis projections. This is the SOTA reanalysis right here, and I was working on it in a class. So what I'm showing is if you took a cross section along the equator in the Pacific Ocean, so imagine you're looking at depth and along longitude, and this is the velocity field. So what you've got is at the surface, the negative values are showing you westward flow of the water. It's forced by the trade winds. This sets up a pressure gradient, and then you have this eastward return flow of the equatorial undercurrent. Now, we were interested in this because my advisors had put out a paper that said, okay, we see in the climate models that there's going to be an intensification of the EUC, and that has implication for islands that stand in its way where there are coral reefs. And I was kind of curious and started looking, well, what do we know about the past conditions or the past trends in that EUC and that current? And what we found was that there was actually a significant trend where the EUC is getting stronger. It's like, would we notice that trend if we were sitting there in a boat? No, not really. But at least in this reanalysis product, we did find significant trends and shoaling of the equatorial undercurrent. Now, what I want to point out is this scale difference. This is like thousands of kilometers. And I'm interested in animals that are on the millimeter scale. There is this huge gap. And for example, what we wanted to understand was how corals that live on these equatorial islands, what are they dealing with? So when an island is sitting there, you've got, this is now a depth projection of like a make-believe little island. And the equatorial undercurrent comes up, you get topographic upwelling. Someone's actually told me, no, it's actually wind-driven upwelling. It's like, okay, fine, whatever, it's upwelling. That happens on the western coast of those islands. It brings up cold water and there's like turbulent mixing. And the idea in the context of climate change is that this source of cold water could provide a refugia for these little corals and bigger corals that live there. And we can actually see it when we look at the structure of the nutrients at the surface around this island. So the problem is this island is about a few kilometers in diameter. The models do not represent it. How do I know what's going to happen? So that was the whole motivation for my postdoc pursuits and now my career, which I did not expect to happen. I thought I would continue studying corals, but I kept having more questions that involved models at the large scale and the small scale. So that's why I do what I do now. I still love corals though. And I still go diving. I'm a volunteer diver at the New York Aquarium. So I still get to be around animals. It reminds me that this is why I do what I do. Okay, so a very simplistic view of a general circulation or global climate model versus the Earth system models. So, and again, I'm a biologist, so if anyone has a different perspective of how they'd like this defined, I fully accept it. This is how I think of it. So originally we have these models and you've got an atmosphere that is solving equations about convection and processes, and it's kind of talking to the ocean and ice, and there's all these different forcings going back and forth. And really that was focused on, you know, what is going to happen if we change the radiative balance of our atmosphere, if we are allowing warming to happen. That's a simplistic overview, but when we go to the Earth system models, it becomes much more complex. We're adding in biogeochemistry. This is a schematic talking about GFDL's Earth system model and just the specific atmospheric chemistry layers that we've added, ocean ecology and biogeochemistry, and then the plants and the land ecology. So then we can start asking the questions, okay, we've done CO2 emissions. We're bringing carbon into this question. And what is the fate of that carbon as it moves through the ecosystems? And all these other biogeochemical elements. I'm focusing on carbon because that's kind of one of the driving motivations, but there's a lot going on in these models. So what we have learned, at least from the projections, so this is taken from Kwiatkowski et al. 2020, and this was using the CMIP6 Earth system models ensemble to look at what are the projections for future conditions under a high emission scenario. So broadly, this isn't surprising. We're seeing projections for end of century being warmer surface temperatures and reduced pH, so warming and acidification. And the little stippling indicates the models all agree or more or less agree with the sign or the direction of that change. And we have a lot of other information from those models, like with oxygen, and this is net primary productivity. But we're seeing that even though like these models are becoming more comprehensive, we don't have necessarily perfect agreement everywhere. And in some cases with net primary productivity, we don't necessarily have agreement at all. So there are these opportunities for the comprehensiveness of these models to continue evolving, to continue improving. So we're not done yet. Yes, we have these really cool tools that look at the Earth system and take into account all of these processes, but there's still more to be done. Thank goodness, because that's why I have a job. So this, I'm going to start talking about a recent paper we submitted about new developments in our models, relatively new. I mean, it's not brand new, but it's in our most recent submission to CMIP6 about how this new way of showing iron deposition to the ocean affects how we project what's going to happen with the ocean biogeochemistry. So these are, and then my co-authors, and what I'm showing here is just a dust plume coming off of Africa and being convected out over the ocean. NASA gets such beautiful pictures. But that really just illustrates this process, because in earlier versions of our model, and I'm going to say this again in a minute, but in earlier versions, the atmosphere is doing this process of moving dust out over the ocean, but this signal going from atmosphere to ocean was just being prescribed as a climatology. It wasn't seeing what the atmosphere said in terms of how much dust was up there. And until recently, or now, it does see that. And so that changes what the ocean, like what the phytoplankton and other organisms are seeing from the atmosphere. So it's essentially becoming more holistic. It's more like our Earth system. It's more realistic. So a simple diagram of pretty much what I just said, but if pictures are more helpful because I'm more visual than a words person. You get the wind, it suspends dust in the air. Some of that moves out over the ocean. It's deposited onto the ocean. There's dry and wet deposition. So like if it hits rain droplets, that pulls the dust out of the air. This comes to the ocean surface. Some of it's dissolved and releases, among other things, iron. That's what we're most interested in. And in iron limited regions, it stimulates phytoplankton growth. And then that can have a trophic cascade and stimulate the other little guys that eat the plankton. So you can imagine there's multiple levels of biology that we're interested here. And then particulate organic flux. So that's part of the carbon cycle, and that can sometimes get entrained into the deep ocean. So this is the process I was talking about. It's this deposition, what the ocean is seeing about how much iron is coming into it. That process right there is what essentially was now turned on in terms of what it can see from the atmosphere. So the previous, this is just a little schematic. It was this prescribed like monthly climatology of what that looked like. And now it's coupled, it's informed by that atmospheric signal. So I'm going to run through this pretty quickly, but this is about the idea of CMIP and how they come up with scenarios for what we say are possible futures. Future scenarios, they have to do with global development policy, emissions, and they're called the shared socioeconomic pathways now. That's the breakdown of the number system. So the implications when we think about dust in these different scenarios, in a world where maybe it's becoming warmer and drier, and then how we are changing also our land use can affect how much dust is available to be picked up into the atmosphere, and the volume that can be advected away. So if you will, historical imagery of the Dust Bowl back in our history and US history, and it's pretty dramatic what can happen. And that was associated with very dry conditions and heavily farmed agricultural human activity. So this is just reiterating what I kind of said more simply before, but that dust coming over into the ocean and the processes that it stimulates. So my question was, all right, is there a difference? Like when you keep that climatology versus you let the ocean see what the atmosphere is feeding it. So what I did was I ran another simulation. I called it the static dust. It's kind of the old way of doing it, but it has everything that our latest ESM4 model has, except it turned off that dynamic coupling of the dust. So we're using our model, future conditions. So this SSP 585, that's one of the high-end emission scenarios. So that's kind of like an extreme climate change conditions. And then, yeah, our dynamic simulation is from CMIP 6, which is publicly available. And yeah, okay, so breaking this down, looking at first, like the causal chain, there's the suspended dust, there's the dust, the atmosphere has a deposition variable, and then the ocean has a deposition variable. So before I show the plots, I'm just gonna give it away. They all look the same. So we're gonna run through them really quickly. They should look the same, or we would hope they look the same. So static dust, you can see most of the dust, highest concentrations coming off of Africa. That's not really surprising. Pretty much the same thing in dynamic. They should look more or less identical because the only thing we've changed is the signal from atmosphere to ocean. So we don't really expect anything to be very different in the atmosphere. However, there will be subtle differences because you've run this long simulation, and like butterfly effect, something slightly different is going to nudge that simulation. So not significant, but if you do notice some differences, it does happen. So now it's the atmosphere's version of what deposition looks like. looks a lot like how much dust was in the atmosphere. So if there's dust available and then it hits rain, it's going to deposit out. Same in dynamic, no surprises. So in the ocean model, total iron deposition under static, this is what the ocean is getting to it. And under dynamic, again, they look the same. And so here you have changed your processes though. This one on the left, oops, doesn't have a dynamic communication of this signal. But because that climatology is based on pre-industrial conditions, it's still a reasonable approximation of what's going to be happening in the Earth system. So it's not actually surprising that it looks very similar for historical conditions. But where we get into the realm of we need to advance the way we're doing the model is when we start thinking about climate change. So now we're going to show the change end of century minus the historical. And all of them all at once. Okay, so there is more dust coming off of the continents where it's orange and yellow. That means it's positive. Where it's blue, it's decreased. Same, it kind of looks similar in the atmospheric deposition signal, but what is changing that, why it's a bit different from what you're seeing in the total column integrated dust, is because of changes in the precipitation pattern. So I'm not showing that, but they're the climate change signal for precipitation affects this deposition. So now we're going to see like it starts to depart from looking exactly like this. And then total iron deposition to the ocean. This is the exciting thing. There's nothing there because the static is a climatology. There is no change. It's the exact same thing it's on the historical simulation as in the future. But under the dynamic dust simulations, now it is seeing this. So the ocean surface is seeing this signal of what's being deposited there. And you might think I just plotted an empty graph, but I did not. I did actually do the change. There was ones and zeros in there, data, it was just all zeros. All right, yes. So there's the climatology, delta T over time. It's not going to change because I keep prescribing the same thing. Okay, so now what does that mean for the biogeochemistry? I've changed that input of nutrients to the ocean. So if you think about, was it John Martin, I think, who was saying about if you put iron into the ocean in these high nutrient but low chlorophyll areas, you can draw out a lot of carbon out of the surface ocean. And that's because they were iron limited in those areas. So you can imagine if you're allowing this signal of more iron to the surface ocean in areas where it was iron limited, it's going to affect how the organisms respond. So this plot shows the limiting nutrients, the distribution of what's limiting phytoplankton growth. So what's the thing they need most to thrive or to grow? And I have in blue is macro. I just put together nitrogen and phosphorus. In red and orange is the iron limitation. So again, historical conditions, static and dynamic simulations, they more or less look the same. That's not surprising. Under static conditions in the future, what we do see, we lose the Atlantic Ocean. There's no longer any iron limitation there. And we do see a slight retraction of this iron signal in the central equatorial Pacific. Now, presumably, that is attributable to higher stratification. So if the water column, there's a higher gradient in temperature, it takes more energy to mix, you don't see as many nutrients getting to the surface. And so that now these macronutrients are what starts to limit the phytoplankton around the edges of this iron limitation zone. But under dynamic conditions, remember, now they're seeing this deposition of iron to the surface ocean, and it actually retracts the projections for where that iron limitation is. So that has implications for how the phytoplankton are going to respond. It's also interesting, I don't really think about this as much, but from a geoengineering side of things, if you're thinking about, okay, if you wanted to try iron fertilization, and I'm not saying one way or another if that's a good idea, you want to be depositing iron in iron limited areas, otherwise it's not going to work. So there are implications there. You want to be taking into account what the Earth is doing and where that actually might work. I mean, I presume that would be aimed at the Southern Ocean anyway, but just saying, you don't want to be in the Western Pacific at the end of the century doing that. It's not going to do anything. Okay. So when we look at the organismal response, I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, but I just have static on the left, dynamic on the right. These are the historical conditions. Again, they really should look more or less the same because the deposition of iron under historical conditions is very similar under both conditions. It's not really varying. So otherwise, these two simulations are identical, more or less. So we see these like high and near the upwelling regions, equatorial upwelling, we get high levels of plankton productivity because that's bringing up nutrients from depth. And you already have some deposition of iron, like even though we're looking at this change signal, it's not as if there's no deposition that's happening on top of. It's just that's kind of what we're trying to get at. And then you can see sort of the relatedness here. You've got primary production. You can imagine the zooplankton eat the phytoplankton, the zooplankton and phytoplankton die, and they fall out of the water column at 100 meters. So you get particulate organic carbon flux into presumably the deeper ocean. So this is kind of the chain, like imagine the chain of processes in the food web. And I have it up here just as a reminder what processes we're talking about. Okay, I'm going to keep those lines in grayscale. And now superimpose on top of it the change. So where it's blue, things have declined. So reduction in primary production, zooplankton, carbon production, particulate organic carbon flux. And what you can see is that we actually have an increase along the equator here in the dynamic versus mostly a decline under static conditions. And I'm going to highlight also this horseshoe shape. So in the Western Pacific, so what we're hypothesizing there, and we have a more thorough investigation into it in our paper, but here, where this iron is stimulating phytoplankton growth along the equator, that goes hand in hand with consuming macronutrients. So the phytoplankton are like, yes, I have iron, now I can eat everything else, like in balance. And then as this surface water is advected, moves westward, it's now been depleted. So what you have happening, even though they're no longer iron limited, now with the downstream effect and what's getting subducted is actually quite low in nutrients. So you have this enhancement of the gradient along the Pacific Ocean where it's sort of like, yay, the phytoplankton are eating. And then, oh, look, we're even more starved over here, or more restricted. I shouldn't say starved, but so if you look at this difference between dynamic versus static, you get this, it's of this kind of horseshoe and red shape. It's a little misleading. I don't want it to be misleading. We are not seeing really an increase in zooplankton production. There's just more under dynamic than there is under a static deposition future. We are actually seeing more production, primary production, when you look at NPP along the Pacific. So that actually, that actually is an increase there. So it's just interesting. So it's kind of when you are trying to think, okay, what's the future of like the biological future of our oceans? You want to be taking into account these sources of nutrients to understand where, that's sort of the base of the food web, right? I mean, fish don't necessarily eat phytoplankton, but eventually you get to that cascade where like that has a nutritional implication for important fisheries in those regions. So another thing we considered, and this is a little more complicated, was oxygen. So in the process of particulate organic carbon coming out of the surface, it gets remineralized, it consumes oxygen in that process and releases nutrients. And this is a concern when you think about the oxygen minimum zone. So this is again from Kwiatkowski. I use these figures a lot. This is showing oxygen subsurface. So you think before I had particulate organic carbon at 100 meters, and then below that, that carbon is going to start breaking down. So this is just averaging dissolved oxygen. So how much dissolved oxygen is in the water column between the subsurface region. And these bluer areas are what we think of as these oxygen minimum zones. And the concern for organisms is we need oxygen, they need them, they need oxygen. It's important for metabolic processes. So if it gets too low, it can affect their biology, like just how they function, how they survive. So we looked at, and I'm going to keep it up there just to remind what we're looking at. we looked at this hypoxic volume of water. How much water in the Pacific? What's the change in like how much of it is below a certain level? And we use this level of 120 millimoles per meter cubed. Yeah, I said that right. A colleague of ours used that to define the OMZ extent. Like this is the edge of what we consider the OMZ. In this color bar, it's kind of this blue outline here. So think if you were like summing up all the volumes of water in that Pacific area between those depth levels and said, okay, how does that volume change over time? It's kind of a funny thing to think about, but it's also quite cool. So first, what I'm showing here is that depth integrated total volume. So it's like a cube of water or something, if you can think about that. It's like a total amount of buckets of water. And I'm showing first the pre-industrial control for both of these simulations. So the pre-industrial control is a simulation we run without any forcing, like emissions forcing. We let the model run so we get a sense for internal variability because it wiggles, it moves, it still evolves a climate over time. And it gives us a sense about what level of variability is noise in our experimental simulations and what level we can say this is a signal, this is a climate force signal. So this is the pre-industrial control. And what's a little difficult is just how much it wiggles, like it kind of like there's some really large variability, particularly at the end. These years here correspond with the years in the experimental simulation. So the experimental simulations branch off here at year 101 off of the pre-industrial control, and then they start from the 1800s into mid-1800s into 2100. And so the takeaway from this is that static versus dynamic, they're overlapping, they're going back and forth. The noise, like the amplitude of these wiggles is such that it's like we really can't separate anything here. Maybe if you're looking at the end of the century, the two darker lines of static and dynamic experiments could be higher, but then this pre-industrial control one has this big bump here and it had no climate forcing. So it's just more complex than a simple like separating of these processes of deposition. And what we would probably need is to run more ensemble members so we could see through that noise. We could average it out and say, okay, maybe this was just a weird simulation. You want to get more of the variability. You want to span more of that uncertainty. So that was a little unsatisfying aspect of this study because it would have been really cool. But it just means, okay, we have another study to pursue because we didn't get a conclusive answer with just this set of experiments. We need more information. So just to summarize this quickly, it's really cool that the advancements we're making with ESMs, not surprisingly, they're representing our real world conditions more and more. And that's really useful for looking at marine ecosystems, like what can we anticipate for how their environments are changing. Just summarizing what we saw, so that productivity change, it just moved where we were seeing the change in productivity, that pattern. It had that kind of red tongue along the equator with that blue horseshoe around it. So it's just the change in gradients, the shifts and the redistribution of where the productivity is happening under future conditions. And then reiterating oxygen, it's not really clear what's happening. So it was interesting to look at, but not quite conclusive on this study. How much time do I have left? I just want to check. Oh, look at that. Hello, that's a clock. And so about 20 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to probably go through this quickly. So now switching over to more of a regional perspective. So coasts, when you think of fisheries and marine resources, they, this is a Tickler et al., I love that name, has this map of like where fish catch. So tons per kilometer squared of fish were caught in the 21st century. And it's very red near the coasts. So that's where we do our fishing. It's also where a lot of the animals live. But the thing is, like a lot of our general circulation models, our global climate change models, or global climate models, are at a pretty coarse resolution. And this is showing GFDL models along the Atlantic coast. So where we would think the Gulf Stream is, it's showing mean current speed. And at low resolution, you don't really see a distinctive Gulf Stream. You see kind of this split in current speed, but it's not until you get to like 1/10 of a resolution on our CM 2.6 that we have a more definitive Gulf Stream. And you would imagine that ecosystems, fisheries, where the Gulf Stream exists, you want to understand what's happening with that feature because the fish are probably going to respond to aspects of that. So I really think global climate models or general circulation models, ESMs, they are great, they are awesome, but they're not the be all end all for ecosystem studies. So one of the motivations for looking at smaller scale things, this downscaling approach, as we call it, is that we can sometimes get a better picture of these really important features, just like I showed with the Gulf Stream a second ago. And this is an example from Holt et al., where they're looking at a global model of change in sea surface and net primary productivity. Sorry, I see the red and blue and I'm like temperature. No, this is phytoplankton this time. So net primary productivity. And in the global model, the Irish seas, they're very blue off of Europe, this whole area. But when they increase the resolution, so it's kind of the same area, the sign changes. And what it allowed going into that higher resolution is looking at the coastal bathymetry, the tidal impacts. It's doing all this mixing. So even under, future conditions where, yes, it's getting warmer and there's higher stratification, it's such a dynamic region that it actually pulls in all those nutrients and brings them back up to the surface. So it can completely change the picture of what we project when you start going into those smaller scales, because there are features in the bathymetry, in the current system that are relevant to these ecosystems that the global model just isn't equipped to do. It's not even a fair question to ask of it. So it's like, we need a different tool for answering some of these questions. And people have proposed that, okay, we're getting really high resolution with our climate models, and they're beautiful. I love them. This is an example of ESM 2.6. It's a prototype, high resolution 10-kilometer ocean. Atmosphere is cool. I'm the ocean person, so what I care about is the ocean. And you might think, okay, well, this is the direction we're going in, and yeah, we are. And resolution is, increasing the global model resolution does help. But these are so expensive to run in terms of the computational power it takes. And I'll get to this a little bit, hopefully, but you need to run multiple ensemble members. You need to see kind of the different possibilities to get a sense for like this probabilistic what's going to happen. So they're great, but we're probably, even with computational capabilities increasing at the rate it is, we're probably not going to be able to produce the ensembles we need at the scales we need to fill all of the requirements for management decisions. So Helen brought this up when I was invited to give the talk. This was a synthesis paper. I led with a very large group of people, herding a lot of cats, very cool cats. I've read over 100 papers. It was a lot. And what we ended up doing was saying, okay, let's break it down. What have we done in the past? What have we done well? And what do we need to do better in order to provide downscaling information, ocean downscaling information under changing climate conditions to managers and to stakeholders, so we can do the best we can to conserve and to sustain. So I'm going to run through this kind of quickly, but the summary, the progression of what these studies have looked like. There are more studies. So this is showing over time. I've binned them in 5-year increments. So this is the, first of all, just looking at the N, and the N carries through across the columns, like it's the same number. It's the number of downscaling studies in each 5-year period. And if just, think that's a growing number, we've had more and more. And this period wasn't, I don't think, all the way done when we did this. So I imagine by the time this was published, that number should have been larger. But at the time of the study, that's, what we're seeing is over time, more and more groups are running these high resolution experiments. They're increasing the resolution. So purple is 25 kilometers, green is 10, and then this dark blue is 5 kilometers. So we're seeing an increase in resolution. More studies are including biogeochemistry, so like trying to make them more holistic and represent the ecosystem. And then the number of future ensemble members. So showing that, having more than 3 and then having more than 6, that's kind of changing over time. It's not as clear a relationship, but what this is telling us is people are refining the needs, like they're saying, okay, we need more resolution, we need to include the ecosystem components, we need more ensemble members. It's also indicative of computational resource availability as more people have access to running these high performance systems or using high performance computing resources. So cool, but a lot of these studies were proof of concept. It's a lot harder to say this study or this model was used to make a management decision. There are a lot of times with these modeling groups, depending on how they're structured, if, for example, it's run by like a one-time grant, if there's not sustained funding for it, it may not continue onward. Whereas there are large organizational groups to do these regional downscaling efforts that just have so many different focuses and getting that information out there to the right stakeholders, to the right managers, and actually getting it implemented. So in this particular example, or in these examples, many of these were kind of a proof of concept. We can do this. And then not so much of the, this is what we did with it. Also might be a different paper. So that could be, they weren't selected for in this study, but it's kind of like, okay, the next step is how do we make these useful? So in that synthesis paper, we came up with suggestions for future experiments for doing more climate change related downscaling efforts. And the big question, one of the big questions I took away from it, that you always want to be thinking, what am I trying to get from this? Do I really need, I call myself a resolution goblin. I love small scales. I always want to get smaller scales. My Rutgers model was at 500 meters, but that's expensive. And if you can get away without doing that, if you can get away with like maybe a coarser resolution model that you can then run more scenarios, that's going to serve your purposes better than having something that's very refined, but maybe you can't validate it at that level of resolution. I mean, it's, is it actually useful? So it's always coming back to this question, what do I need? What do the managers need? What are the questions? What variables do you need? If you need to know about acidification, but you only run a physics model and there's no, carbonate chemistry involved, that model is not going to answer the whole question. So that number one was really important to me. It's really define the question first, because I feel even in my own studies, I have felt like I'm going to make this model and then answer science questions. And it's kind of like we should, have it motivated by those research, just keep bringing it back to the living marine resources that you're trying to serve. So I'm going to pause for a second because there's a split in that diagram. There's dynamical downscaling, there's statistical. I'm not going to talk about statistical in part because I do dynamical and I can speak more informedly about that. So what you're doing, it's kind of like a recipe. That's the way I think of it. You're solving for these equations of thermo and fluid dynamics, but just like the GCMs, but now you're doing it in a smaller area. So I think of it like a recipe. This is my domain that I'm working with, and we don't need to go into it, but this is just sort of details about the setup. You specify the container. So like what's forcing it, what's at the boundaries, what's its topography. You have where you're cooking it. You're putting it on a supercomputer to run. Might blow up a few times. And then hopefully at the end, you have this simulation with information that's useful and you'll continue refining it indefinitely if you're a foodie. So it's, this is how I mentally conceptualize the dynamical downscaling, but you're effectively running an ocean model very similar to what's in the global model, but now you're constraining the bounds of it. You're telling it what's happening at the forcing rather than it communicating back and forth. This is one-way downscaling, I should say. Meaning it's not communicating back to the atmosphere. It's not communicating out to the ocean at the sides. It's just getting information from the coarser regions. So anyway, a lot of what I have to say applies to dynamical downscaling, but statistical, that is another aspect of the paper I'm not really going to get into. One of the recommendations we have is to correct for regional biases before you do this downscaling. So you're using forcing from a global model. And if you know that there is a bias, so this is an example from our collaborator, Mercedes Pozo-Bouil, and this is the original GFDL model that they want to downscale. There is this known bias. This is a difference relative to observations in the historical conditions. And it's like, there's a bias from the atmospheric forcing. If you downscale this, you are just propagating that bias and you might even find it's even worse. So if you can correct for that, if you can subtract out the regional biases in the global model before you downscale, you're going to end up with hopefully a better representation of what the ocean state, what you're aiming for. In our study, it was kind of split. It wasn't clear about dynamical or downscaling the GCM bias correction. And part of it is we think they might, it's a break from dynamical consistency. You say, here's what this global model is saying is happening, but now I'm just going to do this adjustment and say, no, you need to go this way. Well, there's not really a mechanistic reason for that other than I know it's wrong. And that discrepancy can be challenging. The other thing is it was hard to actually find information. Not everyone documents it very clearly. So that's in there as well. It's like, did they not bias correct or did they just not tell me that they bias correct? So there's a communication message in that. How am I on time? I should wrap things up. Another recommendation is long enough time periods, what you want to model. So what I'm showing here, it's kind of inspired by Clara Desser's work at NCAR, looking at the large ensemble members of the CESM. And I'm going to try to break this down. This is looking at change in temperature. So end of century minus historical. These are the time periods. And on the left, it's if you're looking at 10-year differences, like the last 10 years or this 10-year period minus this 10-year period, versus on the right, which is the 30-year mean. And what I've taken at the top, okay, it doesn't matter which ensemble member, I think there's like over 40 of them. No matter which one, just show me which one shows the biggest increase in temperature with the 10-year mean difference versus the 30-year mean difference. Show me the ensemble, if I looked at the difference in all of them, and then just what's the coldest. And this can be different, like the ensemble member here could be different from that one, that's fine. But the point is that the spread between the warmest to the coolest, there's a lot more red up here than there is in this 30-year mean. There's a lot more dark blue down here in the coolest. That is not the climate change signal necessarily, because we're in this tiny little time period in a 10-year mean. You might be on a weird phase of the PDO or an ENSO, you don't know. But if you have a very small snapshot of time that you're looking at, you risk having it alias that higher frequency variability. So you want, if you're going to look at time slices, you want them to be long enough so you're representing climate, not higher frequency variability. And this is just from our study looking at simulation duration. So a lot of under 30-year periods for time slices. And then they've got this full transient, and that means it's doing the whole time series, which that is the ideal. But again, you come back to it is computationally expensive. And then time slices less than 30 years. We have seen a progression in these studies and downscaling studies where there are fewer and fewer who are using small time slices. And that's what we want to get away from. And the last thing, so representing uncertainty, and this is a challenge because you don't want to run just one scenario. You want to try different aspects of what that, test out different ways the future could change. And this is from all of those studies. And what you see, I'm going to go through this a little faster. Most of them are putting out less than 5 ensemble members. And when you actually look at this, this is from Mike Alexander et al. 2020, showing the Northwest Atlantic Ocean. These are 3 different global climate models that were downscaled. And I'm looking at SST change on the top and salinity, surface salinity change on the bottom. And really what I want you to take away from it is that depending on the global climate model you downscale, they are different. And you have only 3 simulations here, but you can see, this is more blue, this is more red, and that is only running 1 ensemble member from those different models. And what I showed before with the different means, that was from the same model, but different ensemble members running the same thing with slight perturbations. So there's a lot of different ways you can explore those different types of variability. And we need to be strategic about it. That's kind of the take home from that. It's like, you have a lot of options, try to make the best informed choices. So this is a classic Hawkins and Sutton figure showing that like the lead time, how long the model is running, where that uncertainty is coming from. Internal variability tends to represent more on short time horizons. The model, like the modeling center or where it's how it's configured, and then the actual scenario, like the climate change scenario on longer time periods. So this can, but it can change depending on what variable, like the field, the diagnostic field that you're looking at. So this is, Mike Jaycox made these figures for our paper. It's looking in the CCS, or the California Current System, surface temperature. So in this case, we have scenario uncertainties in the lead. Essentially, that's what's just really defining the spread, what we call the uncertainty envelopes, just a schematic to represent, like, these are my possibilities. And what's really driving that is like the scenarios. And you can see it here, like the lower concentration pathway, or RCP in this case, 2.6 versus 4.5 versus 8.5. And that's what's driving that spread. But when you start looking at primary productivity, then it's actually like the model, the biogeochemical model you're using, because different centers put together different models and different levels of complexity. So you have to be cognizant about what you want to look at. So you know, okay, do I need to simulate more of these possible future scenarios, or do I need to look at more models? Like, what are you going to actually make up that ensemble with? And then this is just Al Herman did this great study. It's a lot, kind of used a hybrid approach to dynamical downscaling. So they captured the primary modes of variability using a dynamic model, and then statistically propagated that to give all of these different possibilities. So it's trying to take advantage of the more cost-effective statistical modeling to amplify what you can learn from the dynamical models, just to get a larger ensemble. And it's cool. I don't fully understand it, but it is, what we take away from it is, this is a possible approach to fill out that uncertainty, to have a better idea of the range of possibilities without having to run a dynamical model, which is a lot more computationally costly and time consuming. And this is, sorry, this is they look at the Bering Sea and changes in Bering Sea bottom temperature, and that was what they were aiming to reproduce, and that is what that time series is. So like how, because of important fisheries in the Bering Sea. Yes. So yeah, that was our protocol. Just to summarize our big picture, you know, overall suggestions. Design those experiments with the applications you have in mind. So you're answering the questions that need to be answered. Balance resolution against having those comprehensive ensembles. Like if you don't need to be at sub-kilometer level to answer your question, maybe invest instead in having more scenarios or models or whatever you need to explore to really fill out that envelope. Bias correct, if you're going to dynamically downscale, bias correction is a lot of times inherently incorporated into statistical downscaling. I didn't really touch on that, but that is one of our recommendations. And then, you know, I'm not going to talk about this, but, you know, for forecasts, we need shorter time horizons as well as the long-term climate change scenarios. So very quickly, we're contributing at GFGL to this, this developing NOAA climate ecosystem and fisheries initiative. It's this big project to try to see, okay, what framework do we need in order to provide that information to stakeholders? And it doesn't have to just be that we run the models, but we could also be like providing the information about how they work, how they get set up. And it's just, they make very nice infographics. But just how the whole picture, end to end, you know, operational and, you know, moving the information along. So what we contribute in this is regional models. I'm going to end on this. We at our lab have these 3 regional domains that we're working on developing. We're implementing the same model, MOM6, that's in our system model. And that's, you know, kind of in development. We have a working group that's trying to like get this off the ground and operational across the board. Let's see, all of these are at about a 1/12 of a degree resolution. We have biogeochemistry, it's the cobalt model, also from what we use in our ESM. Just want to make sure I get everything. And this one's the one I'm in charge of. So I'm just working on the Northeast Pacific domain. It's very pretty. That's my recipe. Right now it's about 10-kilometer resolution. We might bring that down, but right now we want to get that right. Like I said, we're using MOM6, running at about 30 years, using Area 5 in the atmosphere, Glorus at the boundaries, river runoff, and our BGC model is cobalt. So we're doing a one-way nested design. That means it's not communicating information back to the atmosphere or to the ocean on the sides. It's just being moved by those external forcing conditions. And right now, just in case anyone wants to talk about this further, we're not really answering science questions just yet with these domains. It is model development, which is maybe less exciting to hear about. I think it's exciting. What I'm working on is trying to improve salinity biases in the model. So one of the advantages of using MOM6 is it's what do we call it? ALE. It's like the vertical coordinates for doing the integrations of the model. And it's supposed, like the end result is it's supposed to do a better job at preserving water mass signatures. And I want it to do a better job of preserving water mass signatures. So what I'm working on is improving the salinity signals. And part of that is improving freshwater inputs as well as working on the mixing parameterizations. So anyway, I will end there. My main takeaway, we need both. We need the big models, we need the smaller models if we're going to be serving fisheries applications under changing climate conditions. No one side of that is going to be the perfect picture. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for an exciting talk. It's really, there's some frontier problems here in modeling that you really touch upon and are deeply involved with. So thank you very much. So we have time for questions.
That was a really cool talk. Excuse me. Thank you. I was wondering about the ecosystem component of the productivity models that you run. Does that include like the actual plankton, like population dynamics as well? So can, like with phytoplankton, can you tell it's like diatoms versus coccolithophores, you know, zooplankton is it copepods or whatever?
Sort of. Okay. So Charlie Stock is the main author behind our cobalt model. So I recommend looking that up if you really want to dig into it. The way I understand is we have 3 size classes, I think, of the phytoplankton and size classes for the zooplankton. And part of my confusion is because I know they're coming out with another one soon. So I'm like, which model is it? But essentially it breaks into small, I think medium, large, but there also is diatoms in there. So it depends on the ecological role, I think, of particular things. So I have looked at with our iron study, for example, the shift in the size classes of those plankton. And I don't have really good figures of that yet. But it also reflects some of the results we just saw, that similar horseshoe shape. So that's what I've got.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks from me too, Liz. That was a really fantastic talk and you did a great job giving us a summary of like a really wide range of cool projects that you're working on. I have to admit that I don't have a good appreciation for what the main drivers are hypothesized to be in that huge spread in NPP that you showed at the beginning of your talk. But then you showed that you're, accounting for more realistic dust deposition has a really big impact on the primary production. And I was wondering what role that plays in the spread. So is everybody using the same climatology? So it's important, but it's not creating spread? Or are people using different iron dust depositions, and that might be driving some of the huge discrepancy you see in the ensembles?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It's both. And even beyond that, some models don't use iron. Some models are still using climatologies. How they define it could be different. I think there were 4 CMIP6 models that are using dynamic dust now. So it's not everybody, but that's exactly probably, that is probably contributing to some of that spread. And I think Kelly Carney's paper got into that more about how these biogeochemical models are vastly different across some of the ESMs. So that's one aspect, and you can imagine one aspect of one variable cycling. So yes, I think that is one of the contributing factors to the discrepancies across models.
Thank you.
Hi, for the sort of second half of the models you were talking about, do you ever use adaptive mesh refinement in these kinds of models to kind of bridge the global and regional scale to get that high resolution, or is it only ever just like fixed, very small resolution?
So I do not use adaptive scales. I have seen that I think it's really cool, and I think it's a good idea. I don't have a good sense about why it's not more prevalent, at least in the studies I've seen. And I think one of the issues we have with these models is if you look closely at the boundaries, we get artifacts because the communication, I mean, you have discrepancies between what is being prescribed at the boundary versus the high speed or high resolve stuff. And then you get like, you can get currents going along it. And thank goodness for Flather, like, and how they try to, like the different ways of trying to essentially zap out that extra energy that's being, you know, produced or propagated, but it doesn't capture all of it. And I think having that adaptive resolution would address it. You know, I've seen models with the triangles, like in some of those different finite, I don't know what they're called, they're finite element. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I'm like, what? All those papers. There's so many like going through my table. Also really like fascinating. And I know those are leading, you know, edges of research, but they don't seem to be making, you know, a breakthrough in the community. And I don't have a good intuition as to why. And it might actually be like, when I think about the triangles, I guess you could interpolate that to a regular grid so you can do analyses, but I've seen them and I'm like, yeah, that's what we should do. And then one of the things with the adaptive grid, though, what's tricky is that your time step in the model, like how frequently you have to run the integrations, the calculations, is determined by, I believe, your smallest scale. So even if you're running a global scale model, if you have something that's very small in like one region, that's going to be what determines that time step, if I understand it correctly. So it still becomes very computationally costly.
Thanks.
Maybe I can add to that a bit. And indeed, I mean, exactly the CFL criterion is always, you know, determined by the smallest scale. And there's one of the very few finite element models actually have retreated. So that's the first FEOM and then FESOM finite element sea ice ocean model. And their version 2, they actually retreated because it's still computationally non-competitive, even with the ability to go coarse where they don't need the resolution and then go higher where they need resolution, and having sort of the same number of nodes that might make it comparable is still just the computational cost is just not competitive to run long-term climate simulation. So it's for small scale process studies, it's great, but for climate, it's still a challenge, but maybe get there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. This is a short one. I was just wondering, in the climate change scenarios in the first part of your talk,
Yes.
does including that dynamic dust coupling, is there actually like an overall impact on carbon sequestration between the scenarios? And can you kind of quantify what these missing processes might mean for feedbacks in the Earth system that we're not resolving?
So I have not looked at it. Quick answer. Looking at how the difference kind of degrades from trophic level step, I don't know that it's going to be huge, but there's a time integration element to that as well. Like, you know, a small amount over time can have an impact, but because we're seeing a gradient, you know, you're seeing the blue and the reds, it might just be a longitudinal thing. Like it's just going to be more carbon buried over here versus over there. So I wasn't super like gung ho about looking into it because I didn't have the sense that it was going to be significant. That doesn't mean it isn't. I just like, I'm usually thinking about the living stuff, and I should be more interested in the carbon burial, but you're right. Like that's what we were looking at with the POC flux. That was the implication there, was this is the carbon flux out of that surface layer. And that's where we're deriving the implication for burial. But we haven't looked at the climate connection for that. And that my sense is that it's not going to be super significant.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the really nice summarized talk as well. I wanted to ask what you alluded to in your last slide on the representation of freshwater, because in the changing climate, obviously we expect quite a change in the river runoff and as a result, also nutrients that come with the river runoff. And you mentioned one of the products, and I'm assuming that coming probably from the entire Earth system, the land hydrography part, or?
So I'm really glad you asked that because I spent the last 2 weeks working really hard on it. So right now, these regional models are not climate projections. We're just working on the historical hindcast because we want to get that right before we start trying to force it. What we're using right now is GLOFAS, which is a the Global Flood Awareness System, I think. And it is a hydrology product. Well, the hydrology model is called LISFLUB, but it's forced by the same atmosphere product we're using to force the model. So it has a freshwater discharge over land, and we extract that and apply that at the boundaries of the ocean. So that is reflecting the same atmospheric conditions and dynamics that we're using over our ocean, our limited area ocean domain. I don't know yet what we're going to do for future conditions. I assume we are going to take runoff from our ESM and apply that. And what we kind of developed was previously our method was, okay, find the end of a river and move that water to the coast. And that's what we put in. What I've been developing is look at the hydrological model and take what it says is what's called a pit cell or a pour point at the end of a catchment and say any water that's going into those is coming into the ocean, because essentially the hydrological model is land-based, and that's where the land people are saying, okay, the water has left the system. And I'm like, that's what I want to know, not just the end of the river. So nutrients is not, ascribing nutrients to it is not actually, usually my supervisor does that one, Charlie Stock. So we have this 3-person team in the lab. There's Andrew Ross, there's myself, and there's Charlie Stock, and we're all contributing different components to this. He has a method for doing that, but I don't fully know what it is. He won't give me his MATLAB script yet because he's maybe wants to clean it up first. I don't really know how we're doing the nutrients just yet. And I think it's coming from either our Earth system model or observation information. The runoff is coming from GLOFAS, that's forced by ERA 5, and I'm not sure yet what we're going to do for future conditions. Hopefully that was all of it.
Thank you.
Questions. The National Academies put out a report in 2021, I think, about marine carbon dioxide removal. And then sort of 6 different approaches and techniques, iron fertilization and so on. And are those this coupled biogeochemistry ecosystem models at small scales, would they be good enough or skillful in using this for projecting, what sort of these technologies might imply, or to evaluate them from a simulation perspective? I mean, of course, experiments might be warranted, but so from a simulation perspective, are these models skillful at all to address those ideas?
I think I would need more information to say that. I mean, I want to say yes, but if the end result is to remove carbon from the entire atmosphere, but you're only doing a regional ocean model, you'd have to have a diagnostic or a way of assessing that the feedback into the main climate system from your regional area is actually going to have an effect. And that's something taking a step back from that specific topic, looking at the regional models that we run, they're getting to be very big. And at that scale, you really want to start considering that the ocean that you are evolving does feed back onto the climate. So I think I don't know. I have not myself done those sorts of experiments. I think they could be. I think you have to pose the question carefully and make sure that the bounds of your domain aren't limiting. If there are artifacts that you're getting, you want your domain to be big enough. All those considerations for setting up an experiment to address the question you're asking. So I think, I'd have to dig into it more to give you a more conclusive answer. I think they're very good models. I think a lot of other, like MOM6 is being picked up, I think, by other, institutions as well. So it's a great ocean model, but Yeah, I'm very cautious about answering those questions.
Thanks. No, that makes sense. It's a hard problem. So if there are no more questions, let's thank Liz again for a wonderful talk, and also again for heroic effort to actually be here today in person. So thanks again for being here and giving that talk. Thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you.